Hi everyone, this is the fourth lecture of week 10. And again, please read the biblical text. I will be going very, very fast, and it's not going to make a lot of sense, the videos, unless you've read the story that's in the biblical text because of how fast I will be summarizing the material, okay? Last time we saw how David was slowly winning the civil war that had begun in the country against Saul. Okay. However, you don't truly win until your competitors are dead, right? And this is, of course, what happens to Saul very shortly by the end of the book of 1 Samuel. So notice how fast I went through an entire book of the biblical text, okay? However, before Saul is killed off, he tries one more time, that is poor Saul, to talk to God. And so notice how throughout 1 Samuel, God is portrayed as very problematic, especially with regards to how he interacts with and treats Saul. God first anoints Saul, then turns away from Saul for some kind of mysterious misdeeds, then inflict him with an evil spirit and pick someone else to replace him, though Saul is not dead yet. So this is a very, very, very unsympathetic portrayal of God, okay? And some, of course, wonder whether, God is almost kind of thrown under the bus for the purposes of Davidic propaganda. Okay, they have, interpreters have also argued that this portrayal of Saul maybe, maybe considering this portrayal of Saul, that it is right to call him a kind of tragic figure. Okay, we are told that once God begins a relationship with David, right, he pretty much ghosts Saul. Okay, even though Saul keeps trying to talk to God. Okay, likely indicating that Saul was kind of pious or trying his best. It's just that for some reason God has turned away from him. And again, one wonders whether the early stories about God's random favoritism in Genesis, for example, Abel or Cain or Abraham, all this is a kind of setup, maybe edited, those earlier texts were edited by a Davidic writer. And what does it set you up for? Well, it kind of conditions the reader to accept God's random favoritism of David and his random rejection of Saul by showing you how God has from the very beginning done that. By 1 Samuel chapter 28, so desperate is Saul to get a word from God to find out how this important battle that's coming up is going to go. And this is very traditional, right? You would go see a medium or an oracle or somebody to figure out whether you're going to win or not, right? We are told that Saul, so desperate, goes to a medium at Endor. Okay, and Endor itself is a very, very, very interesting name, right? It means literally ayin, so font, the eye or pond or source. That's what I means, okay? And Dor means generation. And all of that seems to hint, the name of this place seems to hint that this is a kind of ancestral cultic site. Okay, and this is what happens when Saul goes to see this medium. We are told in 1 Samuel 28, verse 6 and following. When Saul inquired of the Lord did not answer him, not by dreams or by Urim or by prophets. And then Saul said to his servant, seek out for me a woman who is a medium so that I may go and inquire of her. And the servant said to him, by the way, there's a medium at Endor. So Saul disguised himself, put on his other clothes, and went there, he and his 2 men with him. And they came to the woman by night. And he said, consult a spirit for me and bring up for me the one whom I name to you. And the woman says, surely you know what Saul has done, how he has cut off the mediums and the wizards from the land. Why then are you laying a snare for my life to bring about my death? But Saul swore to her by the Lord, as the Lord lives, no punishment shall come upon you for this thing. And then the Lord said, whom shall I bring up for you then? And he said, bring up Samuel for me. And when the woman saw Samuel, she cried out with a loud voice. And the woman said to Saul, why have you deceived me? You are Saul. And the king said, have no fear. What do you see? And the woman said to Saul, I see a God. I see a divine being. I see gods, okay, coming up from the ground. And he said to her, what is his appearance? And he said, an old man is coming up. He's wrapped in a robe. And so Saul knew that it was Samuel. And he bowed with his face to the ground and did obeisance. Okay. I don't have time, unfortunately, to go over all the very, very weird and intricate aspects of the story, okay? But, of course, by depicting Saul as going to an illegal purveyor of magic, right? One that he himself has made illegal, right? Has made illicit, right? The narrator, of course, insinuates that Saul, again, was impious and heretic. heretical. Okay. Um, Despite this kind of very biased tone, right? If you think about it a bit more, and I think I've said this in other videos, if you think about what really separates various religious officials, like what is the true difference between a shaman or a necromancer here versus a priest? Well, I mean, not that much. It's the only thing that separates illegitimate sorcerers from those who are legitimate sorcerers or priests or ministers or whatever. Okay, is cultural and social, acceptance and authorization. It's really mainly a PR difference. Okay. Indeed, notice that the medium is effective in her magic, right? She is able to do, she's skilled, right? She is able to raise Samuel from the dead. Okay, how she does this is not clearly stated in the text. Indeed, the particulars of the situation, what is she doing? Like when she raises Saul, how does she do this? Is she using a tool? Is she speaking in Samuel's voice? What does it mean that she sees this apparition? Do they all appear? Like, we don't know exactly. All of that is left completely murky. Okay, probably deliberately. Okay, what is clear is that the writers wanted to depict Saul both as going to an illegal medium. Okay, while at the same time wanting to not legitimate her skills by showing that her magic was effective. So they're trying to do a lot of different things, the writers. Okay, they're trying to say, he goes to this bad person and her magic is, I guess it works, kind of doesn't work, I don't know, right? Remember that her magic has to kind of work. Why? Because you need Saul's death to be predicted, right? Why do you need Saul's death predicted? Well, only by showing that it's predicted can you show that it was predetermined by God, right? God wanted, fated Saul to die. And therefore, and also you want to show that Saul, not only was Saul's death predicted by God or predetermined by God, but that he deserved it. Okay, and all these different messages or things that the writer is trying to do. That's in part why you get this very strange depiction of the medium. Okay, she is able to bring Samuel up. Okay, but how is left unstated. However, it's not her who ends up predicting Saul's end. Okay, that is, she's only able to raise Samuel, right? Who then, as the proper prophet of Yahweh, is the one that, utters the correct prediction about Saul's upcoming and deserved death. Okay, and of course, this is what Samuel does. Okay, Samuel appears, he's like awfully grumpy as hell. Okay, he tells Saul that he's going to lose the battle tomorrow and die, and that David will become king. And Samuel's kind of really grumpy, mean portrayal, some have wondered why he's portrayed this way. I mean, certainly, as we've seen in life, as well as in death, Samuel really has it out for Saul. I mean, he never gives up having this kind of anger towards Saul. Okay. The medium's conjuring her magical abilities, right? However, I mean, notice that it's depicted as working. Okay, and so that seems to again hint that it is not only Yahweh prophets, legitimate Yahweh prophets, who have magical abilities. Okay, but notice how at the same time the writer, right, is uncomfortable with this and therefore tries to belittle her power. Okay, how? Well, it says, or the story seems to say, well, this medium, can only conjure up real prophets. Okay, but they can't predict, Saul's fate. Only a true prophet of Yahweh, like Samuel, only he can predict Saul's fate. Okay, we are told that when Saul hears Samuel's prophecy, he's of course extremely despondent, right? And indeed, the woman at Endor, the necromancer, has to kind of encourage him to eat. Okay, just FYI, this story used to be called the Witch of Endor, and then people were like, well, that's not a nice thing to call this magician woman, so now people call her the necromancer at Endor. But I think with Harry Potter, witches became popular again, so now I don't know quite what the terminology for who she is. Okay, anyways, So Saul becomes very, very depressed after hearing this very negative oracle. Okay, now, and that's a little weird too, right? Because why do you consult a prophet or a medium before battle? And it's because if you are told that it's not going to go well, you don't go to battle that day. Okay, much more so if you're told, as Saul is told here, that all of your family is going to die, right? If you find out all your sons are going to die in battle, like, don't go to battle or keep the kids at home. Okay, so it's very weird that Saul becomes really sad and goes to battle anyways, right? Knowing how it's going to turn out terribly for him. Okay, um, again, what you see here, this idea that Saul knew that he was going to die and yet stupidly went out to battle with all of his heirs, there. This again seems to be kind of a propaganda justifying the role that David played, or more likely, the text keeps saying didn't play in Saul's demise, right? Saul, this narrative hints, has given up. He knew that his whole family was going to end up dying on the battlefield, but went anyways. So it is his fault, not anyone else, not David, okay, that all of Saul and his sons end up dead. Okay. Indeed, rumors of David's involvement in the death of Saul and his sons must have been rampant, okay, because the narrative keeps reasserting how David is not, read it, not at the scene of Saul's death, okay, and this seems to be this message, seems to be the point of 1 Samuel 29 and 30, okay, which is at the very end of the book of 1 Samuel. And it describes, in these chapters, it describes how David, who was just pretending to be friends with the Philistines, right? How before this important battle, the one in which Saul will die in, right? This battle between the Israelites and the Philistines, how the Philistines, who he's somehow interacting with, how they tell David, no, we can't trust you to fight for us, so, instead go home. Okay, and notice the subtext here, right? The subtle message, right? David is really, 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 truly loyal to Israel. Okay, even though he's, I don't know, probably always talking about the Philistines for some reason. Okay, so as when you read this chapter, you'll notice. So because of this, David, we are told in 1 Samuel 30, goes home. Okay, and when he gets home, he realizes, oh crap, my entire household has been kidnapped by the Amalekites. Now keep this group in mind. Okay, so we are told because his entire household has been kidnapped by Amalekites, that David has to go and save them, save them all, rescue them, which takes a while. And all this, we are told, is going on, right? So while Saul and his sons are battling in this kind of major battle with the Philistines. Okay, so notice what the story keeps reiterating or saying. David is not at the scene of Saul's death, okay, and therefore in no way participated in the battle against Saul with the Philistines. He had absolutely nothing to do with the Philistines killing Saul, okay. Why? Well, because, David wasn't really friends with the Philistines anyway. He was just pretending to be friend. And by the way, David wasn't allowed to fight in this particular battle. And he was also super busy because his whole family was kidnapped by Amalekites. Okay, notice how much protesting there is. Okay, which speaks kind of the opposite, right? All this protesting shows there must have been rampant rumors, okay, that David was doing exactly the things that he is denying in this text, that David was in some way aligned with the Philistines, that he was fighting against his own fellow Israelites, right? That he was in a large way responsible for the death of Saul and his sons, okay? Indeed, the suspicion of David's role, right, in the ending of Saul's house or his family, it increases when we look at the two accounts of how Saul dies. Okay, and the first, account is found in 1 Samuel 31. The second account is in the next book, 2 Samuel 1, and I think the break there is deliberate. Okay, and the break is there to make sure that the reader cannot figure out that there are discrepancies between the two tales, okay? So let's take a look at the first one, 1 Samuel 31, the first account of how Saul dies. I'm going to read from verse 2 and following, 1 Samuel 31, verse 2 and following. The Philistines overtook Saul and his sons, and the Philistines killed Jonathan and Abinadab and Malchishua, the sons of Saul, and the battle pressed hard upon Saul, and the archers found them, and he was badly wounded by them. And then Saul said to his armor-bearer, draw your sword and thrust me through, so that these uncircumcised may not come and thrust me through and make sport of me. But his armor-bearer was unwilling, for he was terrified. So Saul took his own sword and fell upon it. And when his armor-bearer saw that Saul was dead, he also fell upon his sword and died with him. Okay. In this short narrative, we are told that all of the sons of Saul are already killed. Okay. Notice how, Jonathan, David's BFF, is killed, and David is nowhere to be found helping him out. Okay. But okay. After his son's death, we are told that Saul, injured by archers, tells his armor-bearer to kill him, but that his armor-bearer refuses out of fear, and so Saul has to kill himself by leaning on the sword. And so why does Saul kill himself, right? And notice the lack of condemnation of suicide here. Again, that's a kind of modern thing introjected into the text. Well, notice that Saul says he doesn't want the uncircumcised to kill him and make sport of him. Okay, that is, he seems to indicate that he doesn't want to be killed by a foreigner, especially by his enemies. Okay, nor does he want to be tortured or his body mutilated. Okay, which is indeed what happens when the Philistines, we are told, find the dead bodies of Saul and his sons. They do mutilate them, right? And as I stated before, it's what happens after that is that the town of Jabesh Gilead, again, this very interesting town, does a kind of covert rescue operation and bring back the corpses of Saul and his sons and give them a proper burial. Okay, and this brave act by the people of Jabesh Gilead, it shows pretty clearly that some in Israel, especially those clans affiliated with Saul, believed till the very, very end that he was and remains the legitimate king of Israel. Okay, indeed, it is telling that it is these loyal members of Saul's family or Saul's clan or those affiliated with Saul, not David, who's supposed to be, I don't know, so in love or so love Jonathan, who takes this great risk to bury Saul and his sons properly. Okay, so speaking of David, where the hell is he when all this is going on? Oh, right, he is not on the scene. Okay, and yet somehow, though David has nothing to do with Saul's death, and though he's not on the scene, he is oddly the first one to be told about Saul's death in the next book, in 2 Samuel 1, where we get a very slightly, a slightly different account of how Saul dies. And this is how 2 Samuel 1 and following describes it. After the death of Saul, when David had returned from defeating the Amalekites, David remained 2 days in Ziklag, and on the third day, a man from Saul's camp, with his clothes torn and dirt on his head, when he came to David, he fell to the ground and did obeisance, and David said to him, where have you come from? And he said, I have escaped from the camp of Israel. And David said to him, how did things go? Tell me. And he answered, the army fled from the battle, but also many of the army fell and died, and Saul and his son Jonathan also died. And then David asked the young man who was reporting to him, how do you know that Saul and his son Jonathan died? And the young man reporting to him said, I happened to be on Mount Gilboa, and there was Saul leaning on his spear while the chariots and the horsemen drew close to him. And when he looked behind me, he saw me and called to me, and I answered, here, sir. And he said, who are you? And I answered him, and I said, I am an Amalekite. And he said to him, come stand over me and kill me, for convulsions have seized me, and yet my life still lingers. So I stood over him and killed him, for I knew that he could not live long after he had fallen. And I happened to take the crown that was on his head and the armlet that was on his arm, and I have brought them here to you, my Lord, right? Yet, okay, so this is a second account of Saul's death. Notice how suspicious this is. Okay, for one, the timing, especially when you compare this account to the preceding account in the other book, right? The preceding book. Notice how the timing doesn't make any sense, okay? When during the time between Saul's death and the Philistines mutilating his body, doesn't the Amalekite have a chance to grab Saul's stuff? Okay, and moreover, how does the messenger know who to go to once he grabs Saul's crown and his armlet? That is these kind of symbols of royal power. Okay, how does he know to go to David? Okay, also odd is how the Amalekites' description of Saul's death doesn't match up with the description in 1 Samuel 31. In 1 Samuel 31, Saul wounded. He asked his armor bearer to kill him. Why? Because he does not want to be killed by a foreigner. And yet in 2 Samuel 1, the Amalekite says that Saul, who is lingering, kind of dying on a spear, not a sword, like in 1 Samuel 31, asks him, a foreigner, right? An Amalekite, an enemy tribe, right? To kill him, which the Amalekite says he gladly did, right? But notice this is exactly what Saul did not want to happen in the preceding story, okay? Moreover, what the hell is an Amalekite doing on the battleground in the first place? This battle is between the Israelites and the Philistines, okay? Actually, speaking of the Amalekites, we've heard about the Amalekites before. It's the Amalekites who are the same group that is said to have kidnapped David's family while the Philistines are out there battling with Saul. How is it possible that David is fighting the Amalekites during this important battle, and yet there's a lone Amalekite somewhere near the proximity of Saul's camp while Saul is battling the Philistines? Okay. All of this points to the fact that the Amalekite raid and this kidnapping, all these stories about how David's not on the scene, this is supposed to serve as a fabricated alibi for David, okay? And all of this hints that David indeed played probably a key role in Saul's demise, or certainly was rumored to have. Okay, and the suspicion of this grows when we see how David rewards this Amalekite messenger. Okay, verse 13. David said to the young man who had reported to him, "Where do you come from?" And he said, "I am the son of a resident alien, of Amalekite." And David said to him, "Were you not afraid to lift your hand to destroy the Lord's anointed?" And David called one of his young men and said, "Come here and strike him down." So he struck him down and he died. Okay. And David said to him, "Your blood be on your head, for your own mouth has testified against you, saying, I have killed the Lord's anointed." Notice that David, using an excuse, okay, that the Amalekite killed the Lord's anointed, kills the messenger, right? That is, killing the only other person who can testify as to what really happened, right? That is, namely, speak to David's likely involvement in the death of Saul and his sons. Okay. After this, we are told that David sings this kind of beautiful lament for Saul and David, again showing the association between David and music. He, however, doesn't seem too upset really, because right afterwards we are told he goes to conquer another city. Okay. So all of this, this is probably not the David you heard of. Okay. So notice how effective the propaganda in the biblical text was. Okay. Indeed, a lot of scholars, once you start looking beyond the kind of propaganda, the outward reading of the biblical text, a lot of scholars argue that underlying this, very romantic figure of David the underdog was probably actually a cold, devious kind of mob leader, okay, who mercilessly and ruthlessly came to the throne, right? This is really how you come to the throne in the first place, right? You don't do it, you don't gain power by being a very nice guy. Okay, and most scholars believe that Saul did lose his throne, not because he was deranged or ineffective, okay, but because David forced Saul to fight a double-sided war, both with David, an internal threat, and with foreign enemies. Okay, these stories about David thus are propaganda defending against accusations levied against David. Okay, indeed, just because Saul has been killed, likely with some let's say interference from David, this does not mean that David assumes automatic control of the country. Even a dictator has to convince just a little bit if he wants to remain in power. And for David, what he has to do is he has to convince Saul's own tribespeople, the Benjaminites, who are probably, terribly angry at David for usurping the throne and for, his role in Saul's demise, to come on his side. Okay. Hence, these stories are part of the Davidic propaganda to win over the other tribes, especially those who were loyal to Saul. And it is for this reason that the biblical text is so emphatic that David had nothing to do with the various suspicious deaths that constantly surround him. Okay? It is because he is trying to legitimize power to those, right, or convince those who would merely dismiss him as a violent and aggressive usurper.